afternoon. I'm John Vitson, the Menard Family Director of the Sheila and Robert Challey Institute for Global Innovation and Growth. This afternoon, I'd like to introduce you to Veeshan Rayamajhee. Veeshan is an assistant professor of economics at ndsu and a faculty scholar in the Challey Institute. Welcome, Veeshan.
Thank you, John. It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. So, Veeshan, you have a lot of very interesting research related to the relationships between institutions and natural disasters. So could you talk about the type of questions that you like to ask in your research and to answer?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So my research focuses on, well, several things related to disasters, but I like to, kind of compartmentalize my research into three different areas, looking at the impact of disasters on institutions. So that's my current body of work. In the past, I've worked on how individuals and communities respond to disasters and what sort of responses are conducive for successful post-disaster recovery. So what are the conditions that lead to successful recovery versus what sort of factors and what types of responses trap individuals and communities in sort of this trap. So currently I'm looking at the long-term impacts of disasters on institutions. And in the literature and in a variety of different philosophical treatments, disasters have been characterized as these critical junctures in history, right? These moments when societies, the trajectory of societies are defined, right? So depending on how societies respond to these disasters, the future of the economy, futures of countries are decided. And so it's always, but there's no clear it's presented as if it's a black box, right? These critical junctures that determine history, but we're not quite sure how that actually plays out. So some countries tend to do very well after a disaster. There's an economic boom. Other countries get trapped, and then there are resurrections and political revolutions and so on. And so really trying to unbox the relationship between disasters and institutions, just looking at what sorts of institutional change can disasters trigger. So that's one area of my current study. I'm also very interested in not just looking at the formal institutions meaning legal institutions that are related to regulations, laws, and so on, property rights institutions, but also looking at informal institutions, right? How people interact with one another and solve their collective social dilemmas, right? And I think in that type of, it's very relevant in the current context of pandemic, for instance, right? So it is, whether or not we've admitted or realized it yet, is changed the way people interacted, right? So, and it's very different. Of course, a lot of these questions, the answers are very contextual, right? So the type of disasters, the specific characteristics of the communities, all of that interact in very complex ways, and it's hard to form some sort of general narrative about how this is all going to play out. But at its core, it is a very empirical question, and so I'm interested in also exploring the implications of disasters for all these informal institutions. And I'm also interested in the interaction between the formal and the informal. So obviously there's a lot to unpack there, but these are the sorts of questions that I'm trying to explore in my research.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think we think about a lot of things with natural disasters and how should we react, but we don't think about what kinds of institutions are in place ahead of time and how that's going to influence how well we can react maybe to a natural disaster and how well we can adjust. So could you talk a little bit about the importance of your research and what kind of impacts it has on society?
Thank you. So, the importance is quite simple, right? So there's disasters are increasing by the day. Not just natural disasters, but as a society, as population increases and so on, we face all kinds of problems and, technological disasters, natural disasters, things like pandemics and so on. So there's a lot of disasters happening, and a lot of people get affected by it. So the relevance is quite evident, but just not just from the point of view, from a policy point of view, it's obviously relevant. But I think I like to see my role not as a policy advisor in terms of how to best design policies and so on, but really it seems to be, at least my take on it, is that a lot of so disasters happen, but how societies respond to that can really shape how things are going to move forward. And a lot of times, real disasters actually happen after the natural disasters end, right? Because the implications of major policy blunders then take shape and form. And I think I like to view my role as trying to understand what are the sources of such policy blunders and why do they happen. So that's one side of the research agenda, but not from a policy perspective, just kind of trying to understand human society. It's very important to understand, because these critical junctures in human history, they define us in so many profound ways. And if we don't have a complete understanding of how we individually and collectively respond to these disasters, and what are the institutional implications of it, we won't be able to form an informed view about how we should move forward. And I think it's important just from the point of view of just enriching our understanding. So I think it's very important.
Okay, right. And so although you say you're not a policy advisor, to the extent that you can provide insight into policy blunders, it still can form future policy to make sure that there's thought given to policy and understanding what the implications are, correct?
Yeah, that's definitely true. I think the way I view the role of an economist is not as a policy advisor, but not as a prescriptive.
Right, providing the information that allows others to come up with intelligent policy.
And a lot of times, yes, and a lot of times it's not necessarily that you have the right answers to all the problems.
Right.
But generally, it's easier to pick on solutions that don't work. I think those become more evident, and I think it's easier to point that out. But of course, policy making and all of that is a difficult task, and it's really takes us a different type of personality to be able to juggle with those day-to-day policy issues. So I try to refrain from that.
Right. Okay. And so, are there additional questions that you'd like to ask in the future in your research?
Just kind of unboxing that the institutional implication of disasters. That's a lifelong research agenda. Good. I think there's so much to unpack, and I think because it's also highly contextual, I think there are so many empirical questions that have very serious policy implications that I could ask, and so some of my current projects kind of look into that. So I'm trying to, for example, understand how at an individual level and at a social level, how individual behavior is shaped as a result of disasters. How does that lead to changes in how humans allocate their time, for instance? What are the types of things people do in response to disasters, and how it shapes their interaction at a very micro level? So those are the kinds of questions I'm currently interested in. They're very empirical in nature, but also kind of contextual, so I may not be able to quite fully answer that. So I think it's an agenda that will take a few years at least.
Right. How people react to a hurricane may be different than how they react to a pandemic, for example. Right. And
in the disaster literature, the role of social capital, for instance, it's very well established, right? So there's a number of books and a lot of articles, hundreds of articles written about how important social capital is for post-disaster recovery. So there's a lot of evidence of people coming together and solving a lot of their collective problems, and people coming together in a very physical, tangible sense, right? But then you have a different kind of disaster, the pandemic, for instance, right? Where the very solution that we think will help us overcome disasters is in fact the source of the problem a lot of times, right? So when we think of social interaction, we have to think of it very differently, right? So the very solutions in one case can be the source of the problem in another case, and it's very easy to make major policy blunders when we try to dictate, minor details regarding disaster response and long-term post-disaster recovery policies.
Yeah, that's a great example as well. So thanks. This has been super interesting to learn about your research more. I appreciate you sitting down with me today, and thanks again.
Yes, thank you for this opportunity. I've enjoyed our short interaction.
Yeah, thanks.